Imagine a helpless child, born blind into a poor family in a remote village in Japan. Given these characteristics, his opportunities were greatly limited, dependent on others, and he led a difficult life. But as you know, life sometimes surprises us, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. This is a story that surprises in a bad way. When this little child grew up, it's hard to believe, but he spread to many countries, gathering tens of thousands of followers, and founded the most dangerous cult that history could ever see. The Aum Shinrikyo cult was much more than a group of followers enchanted by a blind leader, Esra Rengis. Shoko Asahara, along with his disciples who were some of the brightest minds in the country, were going to carry out the largest mass killings in Japan's modern history using chemical weapons of mass destruction. The beautiful people of our beautiful country, who are very familiar with cults, now I ask you to forget all the cults you know. As we delve into the depths of this Japanese cult, which sounds extremely strange and even beyond our imagination, Shoko Asahara was born in 1955 on Kyushu Island in southern Japan as Chitsuo Matsumoto, the son of a straw weaver. He was completely blind in one eye and had very limited vision in the other. Because of this, his family sent him to a boarding school for visually impaired children at a very young age. This partially sighted child eventually became a bully who ruled and cheated his classmates, becoming both feared and respected. Although Asahara spoke of attending medical school when he grew up, he failed the exams and never went to university. Instead, he began to focus on acupuncture and yoga. These are common careers for the visually impaired in Japan. In 1978, he met and married Tomoko Ishii, a university student. During these years, he also discovered the writings of Nostradamus, a 16th century French physician and prophet who wrote extensively about the end of the world. Thus, he became obsessed with the idea of the apocalypse. By 1984, Asahara opened a one-room yoga school. The classes started on a small scale, but as the number of people searching for a path increased, the community rapidly grew. Asahara's role in his growth was greatly influenced by his charismatic presence as a blind man exuding wisdom and divinity, and as a compassionate father figure. During classes, he spread the idea that a nuclear war would soon bring about the end of the world, and only the chosen ones would survive. In search of enlightenment, Asahara went on a journey to the Himalayas a few years later. He stayed there with monks to study Hinduism and Buddhism and practiced various meditations. When he returned to his country with photos taken with high-level Tibetan monks, including the Dalai Lama, he used these photos to present himself as a religious figure with international respect, and was extremely successful in doing so. Believing he had transformed into a group, he decided to create a mixed religion of his own cosmos. In this, he blended Buddhism from the world's religions with Hindu gods, added the physical aspects of yoga, and incorporated the concept of Armageddon from Christianity. Armageddon is the name given to the great apocalyptic war that is said to occur when the end of the world arrives. Thus, in 1987, Asahara founded the Aum Shinrikyo cult, meaning Supreme Truth, with a handful of disciples. He then changed his name from Chitsuo Matsumoto to Shoko Asahara. Over time, Asahara's claims became even more audacious. He began giving sermons about his ideas that he had been chosen to establish an army to start the end of the world as soon as possible. He claimed to be the reincarnation of Christ and the first enlightened person after Buddha, and that only he and his followers would survive the apocalypse and govern the new world. Then he began to refer to himself as the Holy Pope, the savior of the country, and the Messiah of Tokyo. Asahara's cult was very active in promoting and spreading to people. Knowing the importance of a strong team very well, their target audience was well-educated but lonely young individuals who had been disappointed in their lives. While Japan was helping to raise a generation of highly educated, technically literate youth who lacked basic social skills and understood little of the outside world, Asahara found their weak points and used all his resources to influence them. By delivering his message to the country's youth through magazines, videos, and books, he appealed to those who were lost and alienated. Then, by giving talks at the best universities in the country, he promised them a simpler, more meaningful life. He even offered to teach them these secret abilities by claiming that they had gained telepathy and the power to levitate. As a result, thousands of people, mostly in their 20s, flocked to Asahara's embrace. Some left their best schools to join the cult, while others left behind their best companies, families, friends, and bright futures in fields like mining, computing, and industry. Japan's high-tech youth were fascinated by his claims of supernatural power, his warnings of an apocalyptic future, and his esoteric spiritualism. In their eyes, Asahara had become more of a divine god than a human being. In some photos, Asahara was shown levitating. This was one of his so-called powers. Another power was the ability to read people's minds. Also, the water he bathed in was considered holy because it touched his body when he washed. The same applied to his blood. Soon, a general headquarters building was opened at the foot of Mount Fuji, with hundreds of people gathered, and spiritual training camps began to be organized there. The training included hours of meditation, little sleep, fasting, and electroshock therapy. They also had to endure extreme physical tests like hanging upside down for long periods, entering almost boiling water, and being buried in a small box for days. During these trainings, members were often given hallucinogenic drugs without their knowledge, and were asked to give up everything from their old lives, transferring all their assets and money to the cult. In return, Asahara would cleanse all their sins and grant them superhuman powers. Disciples had to work very hard to get closer to him. However, some couldn't endure these ruthless trainings and died. Later, their bodies were burned, and the ashes were scattered into the lakes. Some, when they tried to tell the police about the deaths they witnessed, tried to leave the group and were killed without any mercy, and their remains were destroyed. As you can understand, anyone who opposed was seen as an enemy of the truth, and thus murders were justified. As people worshipped him like a god, Asahara's ego swelled, and his delusions became more intense. These factors not only put him in a powerful position, but also made him more dangerous and aggressive. As a result, under his orders, some highly educated members of the cult began to produce weapons of mass destruction, while others conducted human experiments that could rival horror movies. Among these people was astrophysicist Hideo Murai, a particularly key figure for the cult. When Murai read one of Asahara's books, he was influenced by the topics of levitation and telepathy, losing interest in his career and coming here. Over time, he would become the cult's chief scientist and the engineer of the apocalypse. Taking advantage of his high-tech knowledge, Asahara found shortcuts to enlightenment. One of these was the so-called electronic headbands, which were supposed to directly transmit his brainwaves to his followers' brains. Through these headbands, brainwashing and control were thought to become more possible, but users experienced dizziness and memory loss. Thanks to Murai's scientific abilities, Asahara began to dream bigger. Fantasy weapons, lasers, chemical and biological agents, new-generation nuclear bombs to accelerate the end of the world. Cult leaders are power-hungry and never satisfied. Therefore, most of the time they try to gradually control the entire population by entering politics. 18 months before the 1990 national elections, Asahara and 24 cult members under his leadership registered their candidacy for the Japanese parliament. Despite having zero political experience, everyone knew him. They ran a campaign where they sang and danced, but didn't win a single seat in parliament. For Asahara, who didn't easily accept losing, this became a source of anger, and he decided to attack the public in a much harsher and more hostile manner. They started saying they must make weapons to fight, and then began working on weapon production and supply. For this, they teamed up with members of Japan's infamous Yakuza crime syndicate, former soldiers from the Japanese army, and Russian KGB agents. Asahara even went to Moscow to open another branch of the cult for military training and nuclear bomb research. He attracted about 30,000 members, including including those holding high-ranking positions in the Russian government. These new people enabled the cult to access more weapons. They even allowed Japanese cult members to train with Russian paratroopers, learning how to use weapons and drive tanks. Then they purchased an airplane from the Russian government for $1 million to be used for training. In laboratories equipped with state-of-the-art equipment, viruses causing anthrax, Q fever, and botulism were produced. After a few failed anthrax attacks, chemist Masami Tsuki became Asahara's rising star by creating perfect homemade sarin nerve gas. Sarin gas, a mass-killing weapon first invented by the Nazis, is a substance that causes instant death by locking respiratory-related muscles. Through fake companies, barrels full of poisonous chemicals were collected to produce sarin gas, which is 10 times more lethal than cyanide. And experiments began with a massive facility they purchased in Western Australia. Then they tested their deadly weapons on sheep, killing dozens of sheep. However, Australian authorities didn't treat them politely as the Japanese authorities did. A few members were arrested at the airport for carrying illegal substances. As a result, the group returned to Japan and purchased a large building. Neighbors witnessed the group bringing in 55-gallon metal barrels and various equipment. Although no one knew exactly what they were doing was successfully producing weapons of mass destruction. The cult, now equipped with superpowers and holding weapons of mass destruction, had only one missing element. That was a state. In 1994, Asahara issued a comprehensive restructuring order, establishing a shadow government and even preparing a draft constitution that explained the structure of the new nation and the duties of the people. They could now start taking over the Japanese government. On the night of June 27, 1994, a truck released sarin gas near the homes of judges handling a real estate dispute case in Matsumoto City, which was expected to end against the cult. In this attack on civilians, 8 people died and over 500 were injured. The death of 8 people in the group testing their sarin for the first time proved that they were ready for bigger and better targets. The number of deaths was less than expected, but this was just the beginning. They now needed to carry out a much larger attack, but while they were thinking about when, the answer came in the form of an earthquake. On January 17, 1995, an earthquake struck Kobe City, which was the largest disaster Japan had experienced since World War II, resulting in the deaths of over 6,000 people. For Asahara, this destruction was a striking proof of the impending apocalypse. On March 20, 1995, on a typical Monday morning around 7:45 a.m., most people going to work unknowingly boarded the subway, unaware of what was about to happen to them. Specifically, 5 members of the assassination team chose these peak hours and blended into the crowd, boarding 5 trains at different ends of the extensive subway network. Each wore surgical masks and carried liquid sarin packets wrapped in newspaper within approximately 1-liter plastic bags. Knowing that these 5 trains would converge at the Japanese Parliament building, which manages 125 million people, the cult members placed their deadly packets on the floors of the wagons, making holes with umbrella tips a few stops before the convergence point. When the doors opened, each of them dived into the crowd and ran to the area where escape cars were waiting for them. Meanwhile, a total of 11 bags of sarin gas in the trains rapidly moved towards the city center, along with thousands of unfortunate passengers. As the invisible gas spread, passengers began to suffocate and groan with nausea. Some passengers collapsed to the ground, and their bodies shook violently while foam oozed from their mouths. When the train stopped, passengers staggered out towards the exits with limited vision and dizziness, while announcements were made in the stations to evacuate. Sidewalks and roads were filled with injured people. As the police and ambulances reached the train destinations, continuous attacks made it impossible for them to attend to everyone simultaneously. The incoming, blinded, and disoriented victims tried to reach nearby hospitals on their own. Doctors, seeing the same symptoms as in the attack about a year ago, administered atropine, the antidote for sarin to patients. However, for some, it was already too late. As a result of the attack, 14 people died, and over 6,000 were left blind and paralyzed. When fear enveloped the entire nation, Japan's image as one of the world's safest countries was shattered. Citizens became afraid to ride trains, and trash cans and stations were removed. Shortly after, rumors began to circulate that the Aum Shinrikyo cult was behind the attack. 2 days after the attack, when the police raided the cult's headquarters at the foot of Mount Fuji, they found a massive sarin production facility, a stockpile of sarin gas sufficient to kill 4 to 10 million people, a Russian military helicopter, explosives, laboratories equipped to produce hand grenades and methamphetamine, millions of dollars in cash, money, and dozens of people held in cells. However, Asahara could not be found anywhere. The strange thing was that 1 week after the attack, the cult's chief scientist, Hideo Murai, was outside the cult headquarters, giving an interview in front of dozens of news cameras when he was stabbed in the stomach by a Korean Yakuza member and died hours later. Finally, on May 16th, Asahara was found meditating in a large box-sized high area inside the wall of a cult building. The Japanese police, dressed in tactical gear and watched by millions on television, used a massive saw to create holes in the steel walls outside the small area where he was hiding. As the arrest warrant was being read, Asahara, who exhibited an almost supernatural calmness while being taken away, said only, "I understand." He was upset that the number of deaths was low. A few months later, 4 bombs containing cyanide were left in the Tokyo subway, enough to kill 100,000 people. However, due to malfunctioning fuses, the attack failed. In the end, after all this chaos, the cult's main plan had failed, and they couldn't overthrow the government. Asahara's case was called the 100-year case in Japan and lasted a total of 7 years. While about 200 of his disciples were convicted of various crimes, he and 12 people involved in murders were sentenced to death. Then, years passed, and after decades of cleansing, they were all hanged in 2018. It was quite ironic that a cult leader who had the ability to levitate died by hanging. Thus, the cult's efforts to create a new world came to an end. After all this, the Japanese government banned the cult's activities and labeled them as a terrorist group. The cult spokesman, Fumihiro Joyu, was released from prison after a 4-year sentence. Following Asahara's teachings, he changed the cult's name from Aum Shinrikyo to Aleph. Finally, Joyu established a new group named Hikari Nova and legally continues the cult to this day. This event was quite significant for 2 reasons. First, Aum Shinrikyo was the first and only terrorist group to successfully use a weapon of mass destruction. And second, this act was carried out by a Buddhist devout group that adopted the principle of nonviolence.